Okay, well, not too much of a review this morning, but just so we're kind of all brought up to speed and kind of remember what we're talking about. We looked at several reasons to believe that Jesus' message really is from God. But I would say that this is our strongest reason. Of all the reasons to believe that Jesus' message really is from God, this is probably our strongest reason. Sometimes I refer to this as the miracle test. In other words, if somebody can perform miracles, I think that gives us a strong reason to believe that they can really have a message from God. Because, and I think this makes sense, only God can do miracles or give somebody the ability to do miracles. And we saw throughout Scripture that that's the purpose of miracles, starting even in Exodus 4, but all the way throughout the Old and New Testament, miracles are described in this way, as a way to authenticate a messenger, that they really have messages from God. We're diving into, I guess you could say, premise 2 at this point. We're diving into the historical evidence. And this wouldn't be, dissimilar to even think back to Exodus 4. I think it's so great timing that Dustin's taking us through Exodus right now. But if you remember in Exodus 4, God gave Moses the ability to do miracles to authenticate he really had messages from God. But imagine, let's say when Moses was there in Egypt doing those miracles, let's say one of the Israelites wasn't there to witness them. Maybe they were on vacation. No, I guess they were slaves. Probably didn't take a vacation, did they? Let's say they were out in the fields working those days and they didn't actually see Moses' miracles. So they would have to do, I would say, some historical investigation, right? Maybe it was a week later, maybe it was a month later where they heard about the miracles. They didn't get to see them with their own eyes, and so they might have asked some of their friends, some of their family members, those who did see Moses' miracles, hey, did these things really happen? Ask some questions, talk to some eyewitness accounts. That's historical investigation. Now, we don't think of it as much as historical investigation because it's only a week or a month later, but it's the same process that we do, in this case, 2,000 years later, right? We're looking at eyewitness accounts, asking them questions, if you will, seeing if their reports, their accounts of Jesus' miracles are credible. And so we're not doing really anything different than the folks in biblical times as they evaluated various miracles or miracle claims. Now, when it comes to looking at the historical evidence, we could present the evidence from Christian scholars. I'll give you another example of a Christian scholar's material we could look at. This is Paul Meyer. He grew up in a Christian home, but as he grew up, a lot of folks, similarly, he started to wonder and question, how do we know these things are really true? And so he devoted his life to the study of history. Got his master's degree from Harvard, jumped the pond and got his PhD in Europe, and currently serves as a professor of ancient history at Western Michigan University. And he is a noted historian, scholar. An example of one of his books that we could use as we look and evaluate this evidence. Title is called The Genuine Jesus, Fresh Evidence from History and Archaeology. It might be a good resource you want to have on your shelves. We're not looking at the evidence from Christian scholars, though. We're doing something a little bit different, something a little bit new, in my apologetic approach at least. And we're looking at the evidence from a non-Christian scholar, in particular this gentleman, Bart Ehrman. We talked a little bit about him before. I won't go through his credentials again, but Bart Ehrman is a non-Christian, but also very well respected academically, professor of New Testament history at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he wrote this particular book because he, as he describes in the book, was getting very sick and tired of all the, who he calls Jesus mythicists. All of those people who claim that there never even was a historical Jesus that lived in the first century. And so he wrote this book really just to consolidate and lay out all the historical evidence that we have for Jesus. So the evidence is the same, really. The evidence is the same, whether you're looking at it from a non-Christian scholar or from a Christian scholar. But I have found, just in terms of a strategic approach, that non-Christians are more willing to consider the evidence if it comes, for whatever reason, from a non-Christian scholar. So we're taking a look primarily at how the evidence is presented by Bart Ehrman. Now, in this book, he's focusing on the existence of Jesus, showing all the evidence that Jesus, in fact, did exist. That's his primary emphasis of the book, hence the title. We're asking a little bit of a different question. We're focusing more on Jesus's miracles. Is there good historical evidence? Not only did Jesus exist, but did he perform miracles? But the same approach, it's the same approach trying to answer both questions. And even Ehrman, throughout the book, points out that not only do we have good evidence for Jesus' existence, we have a tremendous amount of evidence for other details about his life, including his miracles. And that's what we're focusing in on. Now, one of the things we did last week is we started looking at some of Ehrman's material. He pointed out the various criteria that historians evaluate when they're trying to verify if something actually happened in history. Remember, we talked about if something meets these criteria, or the more of these criteria something meets, the more certain that we can be that it actually did in fact happen. So he wrote, for instance, history means abandoning any type of absolute certainty. We're not going to achieve absolute certainty. That doesn't bother us, though, because we recognize as finite, fallen, sinful creatures, we're never going to achieve absolute certainty in our knowledge. History is just one example of that. But even though we can rarely be completely certain about a past event, some things are far more certain than others. Earlier I mentioned the historian's wish list when it comes to sources of information about the past. So to establish the historical probability, I prefer the term certainty, of a saying, deed, or experience of Jesus, we want, the wish list would be, a large number of independent sources that can be shown not to be incorporating their own biases in the account in question, and that corroborate one another's reports without showing any evidence of collaboration, getting together and just making it up. And the closer these sources are in time to the events they narrate, of course, the better. And so what we're going to see, what my goal is, both today and then next Sunday, before we break for Easter, is to lay out the evidence for Jesus' miracles and show, even on Ehrman's account, or as Ehrman presents the material, that the accounts of Jesus' miracles do, in fact, pass these criteria with flying colors. And so we're going to work ourselves down through this list. I've got 8 reasons to believe the accounts of Jesus' miracles. We're going to do the first 4 today, Lord willing, and then the second 4 next week. You'll notice that a lot of these are similar to the criteria we just had up on the board, similar to Ehrman, or I should say historians' criteria. But I've added a few more and explained them as we go through them. But this is what I would say, this is how I usually present, all the reasons that we have to believe the accounts of Jesus' miracles. And we'll just work through all 8 of these here. The first one is multiple sources. I think this is pretty commonsensical, right? We have multiple sources that say Jesus did miracles. And this is important. Remember, we talked about this last week. When you have more sources, that raises the certainty that the event actually happened. The classic example is in terms of Jesus having brothers versus him having sisters. We have multiple sources that says that Jesus had brothers. So our certainty that he had brothers is pretty high. We only have one source that said he had sisters. Does that mean we should doubt that he had sisters or that he didn't really have sisters? Well, no. But since we only have one account of that, our certainty, wearing our historian hats right now, our certainty about that just can't be as high because we only have one source that says that. Ehrman worked through these 20 sources in the matter of going through, if you go through his book, he'll work through these 20 plus sources, depending on exactly how you count some of the sources. Some sources, some might argue, were written by the same author. So for example, some people would say Revelation was written by the same author that 1st, 2nd, 3rd John was. So they wouldn't be able to count that as two different sources. Ehrman thinks they were written by different people. I think there's good historical evidence that the disciple John wrote Revelation and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So I would count that as one source. Ehrman does it, so Ehrman is willing to add that as another source. That's kind of why I put number 24 off to the side there. Now, we're not going to take the time, we just don't have the time in this class to work through all of these 20 plus sources that give us information about the historical Jesus. I did a lecture series down at the university last year. I think it's a 6-part lecture series where we did work through all of these sources one at a time. So if you want to dive into that material, you can either purchase the book or watch those lectures on our YouTube channel, Convincing Proof. Okay, one of the mistakes that people make, and Ehrman points this out in his book, is that it's more than just the Gospels. Sometimes we think of, even within the New Testament, that the Gospels are our only historical sources about Jesus. That is not the case. A lot of the New Testament books talk about the historical Jesus, and in particular, his miracles, as we'll see. So Ehrman makes this point. He says it's a large mistake to think that when it comes to the New Testament, only the Gospels attest to the historical existence of Jesus. So far as we can tell, all the authors of the New Testament knew about the historical Jesus. So the epistles, for example, the letters in the New Testament, are chock full of references to a human Jesus who really lived and died by crucifixion. These books were written by a range of authors, none of whom knew each other's works or the writings of the Gospels. So we have independent, multiple sources. We're going to move on pretty quickly through that one. I'm not going to go through and kind of point out all of the sources that talk about his miracles, because not all of them do. Remember, Ehrman's point in his book is to lay out all of the historical evidence that just talk about that there was a Jesus, because he focuses on the existence of Jesus as a historical person. We're focusing more on the miracles, but you, being Christians, are pretty familiar, I would say, with the accounts that include his miracles. Obviously, the Gospels, Acts, most of the New Testament letters discuss his miracles, so that's meeting that criteria. And as we'll see, we are going to look at some of these non-Christian sources and Christian sources outside the New Testament, and some of them also describe his miracles as well. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying all 20 plus describe his miracles, but at least half, if not more. Now these sources are independent, okay? We talked about this a little bit last week. We're going to go into a little bit more detail here this week. Sometimes people will say there's really only, when it comes to the Gospels at least, one independent source. That Mark was written first, and then the other Gospels basically just copied Mark and added or invented a few more details. And so we only have one independent source when it comes to the Gospels, not four. We talked about this last week, how, for example, if there was a car accident out there in the parking lot, and Mike saw it and then told his wife Sarah about it, and then Mike and Sarah came in and were giving us the details about the car accident, that wouldn't be two independent sources, because Sarah got all of her information from Mike, right? But if Mike and Sarah were both there and saw it and were giving us details, then that would count as two independent sources. So what about this idea that Luke, Matthew, possibly even John, but definitely Matthew and Luke, this idea at least, just got all their information from Mark and then invented a few more details, so they're not true independent sources? Here's how Ehrman responds to that. He says it's almost but not quite, universally thought among New Testament scholars that both Matthew and Luke had access to the Gospel of Mark and used it for many of their stories of Jesus. This is almost certainly right. It's true. I mean, everybody agrees on this, I would say. Some have taken this conclusion, though, to a faulty end, to argue that all of our gospel accounts, even John, which has little to do with Mark, ultimately go back to Mark so that we only have one source, not multiple sources for the life of Jesus and, in our context, the miracles of Jesus. But nothing could be further from the truth. Matthew and Luke did indeed use Mark, but significant portions of both Gospels are not related in any way to Mark's accounts. And in these sections of their Gospels, Matthew and Luke record extensive, that's one of the criteria, extensive, independent traditions about Jesus' life, teachings, and death. A couple more quotes from Ehrman. I know these are kind of long, but I think it's good to hear it straight from him instead of what I would say he said. He also wrote, "It's important to recall, even if some of these sources are dependent on one another in some passages, for example, Matthew and Luke on Mark, they're completely independent in others, and to that extent, they're independent witnesses. And so it's quite wrong to argue that Mark is our only independent witness to Jesus as a historical person. The other accounts are either completely or partially independent as well. For a historian, these provide a wealth of materials to work with, which is quite unusual for accounts of anyone, literally anyone, from the ancient world." Last quote, we'll move on. "We're not then dealing merely with the Gospels that were produced 50 or 60 years after Jesus' alleged death as the principal witnesses to his existence. We're talking about a large number of sources dispersed over a remarkably broad geographical expanse, many of them dating to the years immediately after Jesus' alleged life, some of them from Palestine itself. On the basis of this evidence alone, it's hard to understand how Jesus could have been invented. Invented by whom? Where? When? How could there be so, and here you go, independent strands of evidence?" Now, I do want to take a few minutes this morning and look at one of these other sources that you might not be as familiar with. We're obviously very familiar with the sources within the New Testament, but let's take a look at this Christian source, but that comes from outside the New Testament. This is writing that we have even down through today. We still have, not the original, of course, copies of it, but copies that can be recreated, or the original can be recreated from the copies, as we discussed last week. Similarly, we have some writing from this early Christian leader known as Papias. Now, Papias is an interesting individual. He was an early Christian leader. He wrote a 5-volume work, 5-volume work he wrote. It was called The Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord. And so it was almost like a commentary, if you can think of it in that sense, right? He's expositing on the things that Jesus said, and it was 5 volumes. Now, he wrote this around the 120s. So early in the second century. Remember Ehrman, when he decided to evaluate historical evidence for Jesus, he limited himself to everything, only things that were written or things that we have from 100 years within Jesus' life. So this would count within that window. Now, we've lost a lot of portions of this 5-volume work, but we still have some of it preserved, mostly as quotes from other authors. So I want to show you just some of these quotes that we have from Papias that, again, is dated to the early 2nd century. Here's kind of a long quote, but take a look at what Papias wrote here. He says, "And this is what the elder," talking about John, "used to say. When Mark was the interpreter or translator of Peter, he wrote down accurately everything that he recalled of the Lord's words and deeds, but not in order." So he's describing that Mark got most of his information from Peter, but didn't write necessarily everything down in chronological order. So we've got an explanation right, of why the Gospels feel or sound a little bit differently, because they're not necessarily put in chronological order. And we have historical explanation of that from the early 2nd century. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him, talking about Mark. But later, as I indicated, Mark accompanied Peter, who used to adapt his teaching for the needs at hand, not arranging, as it were, an orderly composition, a chronological composition of the Lord's saying. And so Mark, he didn't do anything wrong by writing some of the matters as he remembered them, for he was intent on just one purpose, to leave out nothing that he heard or to include any falsehood among them. So we have a little, in this point here, historians love Papias because he gives us a little bit of historical attestation to the writing of the Gospels and what their purposes were and where they got their information from. Very important source historically. And so Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew tongue, and each one interpreted or translated them to the best of his ability. So describing a little bit about how the Gospel of Matthew came together. Well, here's a quote from Ehrman. Here's what Ehrman says of Papias. Take a look at this. He wrote, Papias is an important source for establishing the historical existence of Jesus. Papias was personally acquainted with people who had known either the apostles themselves or their companions, Mark in this case. He's quite specific, and there's no reason to think that he's telling a bald-faced lie, that he knows people who knew the apostles or the apostles' companions. This is not eyewitness testimony to the life of Jesus, but it's getting very close to that. This is be like secondhand, maybe. This then is testimony that is independent of the Gospels themselves. It is yet one more independent line of testimony among the many we have seen so far. And this time, it is a testimony that explicitly and credibly traces its own lineage directly back to the disciples of Jesus themselves. So from a historian's perspective, Papias is important and pretty remarkable. Now I'm going to give you a few minutes to discuss, just chat with those around you, and think through, again, wearing your historian's hat on. If we do have, and it seems like we do, multiple independent accounts of Jesus' miracles, how much does this increase our certainty that these miracles actually happened? Where is that, let's say situation where somebody comes up to you on the street, claims to have done a miracle or seen a miracle, but you only have one source, how much would that raise your confidence? Maybe even talk about it in terms of percentages. How much would that raise your confidence that a miracle actually happened if there were multiple independent accounts of that miracle? In this case, Jesus' miracle, but you can think of it hypothetically when it comes to any miracle claims. Okay, go ahead and discuss for just a few minutes there. Okay, well, I think it raises the certainty quite a bit. You can think about this in other contexts, right? Let's say you have a friend who claims to have gotten a hole-in-one on the golf course, right? Now, you might say, yeah, I've golfed with you before. This doesn't seem very likely. Was there anybody there who saw this? And they might say, well, no, I was just golfing by myself that day. And you'd be like, okay, well, I believe you because you're my friend and I have to believe you. But boy, if there were 10 other people who saw you, right, that would surely raise my confidence that this actually happened. So I think some of this is common sense. I think having multiple independent accounts would certainly raise our confidence that these miracles took place. All right, let's move on to number 3. Number 3 and 4 are going to take a lot more time than the first two. And the third one is the idea of the stories or the accounts, sometimes called traditions. Accounts is the term I prefer. Corroborate with each other. Okay? They corroborate not only at the level of the miracles, so the miracles are corroborated, but also just in their general accounts, just in their general information that they provide about Jesus and his life and his teachings corroborate. And what that does, and we'll see this with a lot of these criteria, is that even if we're not specifically talking about the miracles themselves, Just the fact that their accounts corroborate with each other, that raises the confidence that they're telling the truth. So, for example, we can talk again about the car accident in the parking lot. If Mike and Sarah, or whoever claims to have seen it, give us specific corroborating accounts of the actual accident, the cars involved, how the accident happened, the damage that was caused, that corroboration is helpful. But in addition to that, if they also corroborated at the level of just the general details, let's say what the weather was like that day, what was going on in the background, the individuals involved in the accident, right? Some of the extra details, if they corroborated on those things as well, then that gives them that much more credibility as sources when they discuss the actual accident. Does that make sense? It's the same thing that investigators, detectives, police officers use when they're trying to evaluate a crime scene, right? If the sources that they're talking to, supposed eyewitnesses, are corroborating on all those more extraneous details, it gives them more credibility that they were actually there. And so when they describe the murder, the car accident, in this case miracles, that gives them that much more credibility that they were actually telling the truth. So 2 levels of corroboration, the miracles themselves and the extra details as well. All right, let's look at this corroboration then. Start off with a quote from Ehrman. He wrote, "There's more than ample reason for thinking that the stories about Jesus circulated widely throughout the major urban areas of the Mediterranean from a very early time. Otherwise, it's impossible to explain all the written sources that emerged in the middle and end of the 1st century. These sources are independent of one another. They were written in different places. They do contain strikingly different accounts of what Jesus said and did." Think about John compared with the Synoptic Gospels. If you read those, there's quite a few differences. Yet many of them, independent though they may be, agree, this is the key, they agree on many of the basic aspects of Jesus' life and death. Where did all of these sources come from? They could not have been dreamed up independently of one another by Christians all over the map because they agree on too many of the fundamental details, too many of the fundamentals. So this is the corroboration that we're focusing on. Yes, there's different accounts, there's different details in the accounts, just like if Mike and Sarah saw an accident, they would give us different details depending on their personality and backgrounds, right? But if they agreed on the fundamentals, agreed on the major details, that would raise their credibility as sources, and then in turn raise our certainty that they were telling the truth. Now, one of the things we need to spend a little bit of time discussing is these differences, in particular among the Gospels, because you hear a lot about that. Sometimes this is called the synoptic problem. But when people say that, what they mean is that if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Gospels that are most similar, John, everybody recognizes, is quite a bit different. But the 3 that are very similar, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do have a lot of differences between them. And so sometimes people will make more of these differences than they really should. In other words, they would say that there's just so many differences between those 3 accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they lose all sorts of credibility because they're just so different, and it causes us to think that they were just making it up because the accounts are just radically different. Example, if Mike would say that it was just a fender bender out there, 2 cars just kind of basically bumped each other, whereas Sarah said, no, they hit each other going at very fast speeds, and one flew up in the air and spun around 10 times. That would be such a major difference that we would start wondering if this event even happened, start doubting the credibility of at least one of the accounts, if not both. So that's the argument sometimes that you'll hear about the Gospels. So let's take a look. We'll spend a bit of time this morning talking about these differences between the Gospels. Now, it is true, right? It is true if the accounts disagreed on major details, right? If the differences were too large, that would be a good sign that they're making it up, right? That they're lying, if the differences were too big. The fun example that I always use is, maybe you've heard this story before, but it's just a made-up story, but it drives the point home really well. But it's about 4 guys who go on spring break. We just had spring break recently, right? So just imagine 4 guys get a week off from school, college, a break. They say, we're going to go to the ocean. This works a lot better when I lived on the East Coast than in Nebraska. Let's say they go to Lake McConaughey, right? Big Mac. They're going to go have some fun on the water for the week, spring break, and they have a great time out there, enjoy themselves. The week is coming towards an end, right? It's the weekend now. They're thinking, well, we better get back to class. You know, school starts again on Monday, and we got an exam Monday, and we got to be there for that exam. But they're having such a great time on the water. They think, you know what? Let's stay an extra day. Let's stay here. Let's enjoy ourselves on this spring break. Hey, you know, you only live once, right? Let's make up a lie. Let's put together a story and tell our professor that we got a flat tire on the way home. We wanted to be there for your exam. We were looking forward to it, but you know, life happens, and we got a flat tire, and so we couldn't make your exam. Could we please take it the day after? And so they all agree, yes, they colluded. They got together, collusion, made up the story. We're going to do it. Stay this extra day on the water at the beach. So they get to back to campus on Tuesday. They go into the professor's office. He's very cordial. He understands. No problem. Come back in this afternoon. You can make up the exam, and we'll put you in separate rooms, and then you can take the exam a day late. And they're all excited. They think they've won. They think they got away with it, right? And they sit down to take their exam, open it up, and the first question on the exam is, which tire went flat? So we caught him, right? Because most likely they're going to say a different tire, and then he'll know they were making this up. Similarly, if the gospel accounts had radically major differences, we would be concerned. What's interesting, though, is if the details were too similar, we would also have reason to think that they were making it up. And this is something that detectives and police officers, lawyers, judges, they understand when it comes to eyewitness testimony, eyewitness accounts of a crime. They know this to be the case as well. If the accounts are too similar, I mean, down to the different people using the same adjectives, the same adverbs, describing things too similarly, they start to get suspicious, because that shows signs of collusion, that they got together and made up this story and agreed to tell it in a very precise way. And so what historians, detectives, police officers actually look for, what they would prefer, what raises their certainty, what raises the credibility of the accounts, is if there are small but reconcilable differences. Small but reconcilable differences. Small meaning things that aren't that significant. We talked about before, like the car accident out there. If one says that it was a black SUV, somebody else says it was dark blue. Well, that's a pretty small, insignificant detail. And you can think of how it could be reconciled, because in different lighting, people's visions, you know, dark blue and black, you can reconcile those small differences, right? And that's actually what historians, detectives look for. Take a look at what Ehrman has to say about this. He wrote, "We have already seen that historians who try to establish that a past event happened or that a past person lived look for multiple sources that corroborate one another's stories without having collaborated." Here's that idea of collaboration, collusion. And that is exactly what we get with the Gospels and their witness of Jesus. In other words, the skeptics make too big a deal of these differences between the Gospels. There are differences, no doubt about it, but they are small and reconcilable, which is exactly what historians and detectives look for. One thing that I really enjoy doing is to take the skeptics' hyper-skeptibility and apply it to other accounts that have happened in history. So we're going to do that this morning just for a little bit of fun, and you can kind of see where the skeptics are making a mistake in their hyper-skeptibility, okay? And you can do this with any account. It's kind of fun to do this as a group, maybe a Bible study or something. You can do this with an event that happened recently in the news. But basically what I've done is I've taken an event, you might remember this situation. This happened in 2021, where a large ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. Anybody remember that? Remember hearing about that in the news, seeing that on TV? Right? A huge ship 3 years ago got stuck, and then the Suez Canal was blocked by this ship. But when that happened, I started just noting and writing down all the different ways that this account, which we all could see happened, we know this happened, right? But it's interesting, the different news agencies, how they reported it. And if we apply this hyper-skeptibility of the skeptic to this situation, look what results. You could say, if you're one of those hyper-skeptics, you could say, well, look at all these differences. Look at all these differences in these accounts. The New York Times, for example, said that the ship was Japanese-owned, but the Associated Press said the ship was Panama flagged. Now, a ship usually puts the flag out there for the country that they're from, so this seems contradictory. Reuters said that the ship was owned by a company, so what? Should we reject this story as a lie? I mean, these details are so different. What caused the ship to get stuck? The Associated Press said that the vessel ran aground due to strong winds, but the New York Times said that wind might have been a factor, but human error could have come into play. Reuters said that it got wedged in the canal during a sandstorm. So what is it? Seems like a contradiction here. The different accounts reported different numbers too. The New York Times, they said that 18,840 ships passed through the Suez Canal in the prior year, 2020. But the Associated Press said it was 19,000 ships. So should we reject this as a lie? Is there even a Suez Canal? Well, what did the ship get stuck in? The New York Times said that the ship ran aground on a sandbank, but the Associated Press said it was stuck in clay. What's going on here? Should we not believe these news agencies? Some of them included details that others didn't include. The New York Times said that the ship towered over Ghafar's dusty brick house. But the Associated Press and Reuters, they didn't mention Ghafar or his house at all. So is there even a Ghafar? There's just so many differences here. But should we walk away from this thinking that this event didn't happen? That these folks were lying about the account? No, reporting is selective. And this is the case no matter what we're talking about. Somebody getting a hole-in-one on the golf course, an accident, Jesus' miracles, this situation. Different information is going to be reported, right? Some of it might seem contradictory, but if you think about it for just a few minutes, you can see how, reporting is selective and people might tell different things. And this is just something that historians, investigators, police officers work through all the time. If the differences are small and can be reconciled, even if you don't know exactly how to reconcile them, if you can imagine how the differences could be reconciled, then that really takes away a lot of the bite of this hyper-skeptibility. Let's go through this scenario and see how we could reconcile some of these small differences. It might have been owned by a Japanese company, for instance, but was registered for whatever reason in Panama. Maybe it was a combination of winds and sandstorm and human error. It's not a contradiction, obviously. It's not a lie or an error to round numbers. We all do that. There was probably a mixture of sand and clay that it ran into. That's fairly common. Doesn't take very much imagination to reconcile those details. And it's certainly not an error or a contradiction or a lie to include details that others don't. Again, reporting is selective. Not all differences are contradictions. Now, these are the type of differences we see between the Gospels. There are differences, right? But they're small and reconcilable differences. And there's a lot of work. Some people talk about it in terms of harmonization, putting together a harmony of these synoptic Gospels to try to reconcile some of the differences. Some of them we don't know how to reconcile, but that doesn't keep us up at night because they're small differences that could be reconciled if we knew more information. But because we can't harmonize and reconcile everything, because they're small details, it doesn't give us a lot of problems. Again, wearing our historian's hat. One of these examples, we can even look at one, the sign above the cross. We don't think of this very often because usually when we decorate with crosses, we don't put the sign on the cross, but historically, we know that there was a sign on the cross. The thing is, the four Gospels describe what was written on the cross differently. Again, small but reconcilable. A hyper-skeptic could say, well, that's, look at these differences. They're just making it up. Seems small and reconcilable to me. How could we reconcile these things? Well, it might be the case, right, that the sign said this entire phrase, and then each gospel writer just included part of the phrase or paraphrased it, summarized it. It's not an error to summarize things, right? And from another verse, actually, in the New Testament, we know that this sign was written in multiple languages. It was a multilingual culture, much like ours. So we see signs even in our own town, right, that have the message on the sign written in different languages. The New Testament says that's the case of the sign on the cross. And so it could be, we don't know this for sure, but again, just imagining how this difference could be reconciled, it could be that the different gospel writers were quoting what was said in different languages on the sign. Even if we don't know how to reconcile a particular difference, it's a huge leap. That's a huge leap from not knowing how to reconcile a difference to claiming that it's a mistake or an error or a lie. Now, at this point in making a case for Christianity, we're not claiming that there are no mistakes or no errors in the gospel accounts. That's not the argument we're making. As you'll see in probably about a month from now, as we go through the class, I am going to make a case that the Bible is inerrant, that it is in fact God's Word, and there aren't any mistakes or errors in it whatsoever. But at this point, remember, we're evaluating it from a historical perspective with our historian hats on, and it wouldn't change our confidence, change our certainty in the accounts if there were some minor historical mistakes made in them. So, for example, go back to Mike and Sarah witnessing the car accident. And if one of them said it was black, another one said it was dark blue, hey, that's just a human error. We're not going to dismiss their accounts completely because they made a small historical mistake, right? So I'm not at this point claiming there are no minor historical mistakes in the Gospels. That's not my argument at this point. But even if there were, they would be small mistakes because they agree on the major fundamentals. It's kind of like, think about this. It's kind of like the Titanic, right? Think about that situation. Now we know the Titanic sunk, but there are differences between the accounts, differences that can't be reconciled. Some say that the ship actually broke up into two and then sank at separate pieces. Other accounts, eyewitness accounts, say that no, the ship stayed together the whole time and sunk as one piece. So obviously one side has to be right and the other side has to be wrong, right? Those two are contradictory. But again, we know that the Titanic sunk, and that's the key point, even if there are some mistakes in the minor details. So I'm not bothered at this point if a hyper-skeptic, let's say, just cannot get off the bandwagon that the idea that there are some minor historical mistakes. In the midst of this argument, I'll just grant him that. I'll just say, that's fine. If you want to hold on to that, that's fine. I think you're wrong, but that really doesn't impact my argument at this point, that the Gospels and the New Testament sources are historically reliable, and give us a lot of good historical information, even if, as you believe, there might be some minor historical mistakes. I don't want to get hung up over some minor little detail at this point in the argument for Christianity. Okay, I want to give you another discussion question, and it's similar to the prior one. If we do have then these New Testament accounts that corroborate each other, even though they have small reconcilable differences, how much would that increase our certainty that they were telling the truth? And you can discuss, even as we've done the last couple minutes, a small historical account that possibly couldn't be reconciled. Let's say if we come to that conclusion that that is the case, what we find in the gospel accounts here or there, how would that affect our confidence level? So go ahead and discuss for just a few minutes here. Okay, we got one more to cover this morning. We've got about, 15 minutes left. And so we're going to focus on number 4 now, and we'll be done. And these are that not only do the Christian sources we have corroborate with each other, but the Christian sources also corroborate with our non-Christian sources. And this is pretty powerful. We're going to walk through some of these. We won't have the time to go through all of them. But let's start with archaeology. So we can, I think, put archaeology or archaeological discoveries in the category of non-Christian sources because archaeology doesn't have a belief system, right? Archaeological artifacts aren't Christian or non-Christian, they're just what they are. So let's look at some archaeological discoveries that corroborate the New Testament accounts. Now, there was a time in the early mid-1900s where some were questioning whether Pontius Pilate was even a real historical person, if you can believe that. They thought this was just somebody who was invented to kind of play a role in this made-up story. But all of those concerns were put to rest in 1961 when the Pilate stone was discovered. This was discovered in Israel. It dates to 26 to 37 AD, and it has a Latin inscription on it, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, which is the Latin form of Pontius Pilate. So we got archaeological evidence for Pilate himself, which corroborates the stories again. We may even have the bones of Caiaphas. Caiaphas being the high priest that sentenced Jesus to die. These were discovered in 1990. Historians aren't completely certain that this is Caiaphas, the high priest, that sentenced Jesus to death, but there's good evidence it in fact is. So archaeological evidence is pretty impressive. Another thing that skeptics claimed was made up was the idea of crucifixion taking place in Israel in the first century. For a while, some people thought that that whole account was made up because crucifixion just wasn't taking place in Israel at that time in the first century, so the Gospels couldn't be trustworthy. Well, those claims were silenced in 1968 when the bones of a man who was crucified were discovered. This was the bones of a man crucified in Jerusalem in the first century. So we have archaeological evidence that crucifixion was taking place there at that time. What we have is a recreation on the to your right. What was actually discovered is on the left. But folks who know the human anatomy really well understood exactly what they found when they discovered it. And all historians agree that this gentleman was crucified based on the various things they found in his skeleton. His legs were bent to one side. His arm bones had scratches where the nails had passed through. Both legs were badly fractured from a crushing blow, which was meant to bring on death more quickly. So historians who know what they're doing and archaeologists who know what they're doing know exactly what they discovered when they found this, bones of a man who was crucified in the first century in Jerusalem. So we have archaeological proof that the practice was taking place there. Now let's move on and look at some non-Christian written sources. And depending on how you would count these and number these, A lot of people would say just round it off to 10. We've got 10 solid, ancient, non-Christian sources that at least mention Jesus. Some of them even talk about his miracles, but 10 that at least mention Jesus or describe Jesus and his disciples and what they did in the first century. Now, interestingly enough, you might think 10 is not a very big number, but think about this. We only have 9 sources, 9 non-Christian sources that talk about Tiberius Caesar. So there's a sense in which we have more historical information on Jesus than we do about the emperor at that time. So let's look at some of these non-Christian sources. We'll start with Tacitus, our friend Tacitus, Roman senator and historian, lived towards the end of the first century and a little into the second century. He wrote the Annals of Imperial Rome in AD 115, which was a history of the Roman Empire during the years 14 through 68. So first century, he's writing this history. And in his account of history, again, this is just a Roman senator and historian, he wrote in his historical account of the first century that there was a man, Jesus, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilatus, Latin form, and a most mischievous superstition. Most people think this superstition of his resurrection, superstitious idea, broke out not only in Judea, but even in Rome. So here you've got not, a lot of extensive accounts of his miracles, but possibly his resurrection. But even if it's just talking about Jesus as a historical person, we've got corroboration. And that's one of the keys that historians are looking for, this external corroboration. A little bit more detailed account comes from, and we're not going to look at all 10 of them, but another really well-known and discussed figure is Josephus. Now, Josephus was Jewish, but he served under the Emperor Domitian in the first century. And Josephus, as a Jewish person working in the Roman system, he wrote a 20-volume work called The Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote this towards the end of the first century, and what he wanted to write out was the history of his Jewish people, all the way from Adam through his own time. And Josephus is a huge source of information for historians. It's really the primary way that we know about life and the history and what life was like in first century Palestine. So in his very large work, Josephus talks about John the Baptist. He talks about Jesus' brother James. Josephus wasn't a Christian. He maintained his Jewish faith, as far as we can tell. Did not convert to Christianity. He wrote, for example, that the high priest Ananias unlawfully put James to death in AD 62 and described James as the brother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So he talks about Jesus in that context. But there's another, probably more famous quote in Josephus talking about Jesus that I want to share with you. And this is translated by Bart Ehrman, so you can find this in Ehrman's book. Whenever we translate, just as you know with the New Testament, translations are going to sound a little bit different. So I'm using this translation from Ehrman, from his book. But according to Ehrman, Josephus can be translated like this. This is what he wrote specifically about Jesus. At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds. Here we even have the miraculous being corroborated. A teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. He gained a following with both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, he's writing towards the end of the first century, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. So pretty impressive. Here we have non-Christian corroboration, even of the miracles. So an interesting exercise, and other people have done this, other historians and scholars have said, look, if all we had were these 10 non-Christian sources, Remember that list I put up? If all we had were these, let's say we didn't have the New Testament for whatever reason, right? Or we were just going to limit ourselves to what we could know about Jesus just from these 10 ancient non-Christian sources. What could we know about Jesus? It's pretty impressive. Here's the list. So all these things we could know about Jesus just from these non-Christian sources. Which if you scan through this, you'll see that's pretty much a summary of what the Gospels lay out, right? So they're agreeing, corroborating on the major details. The fundamentals, if you will. And so we've got non-Christian ancient sources affirming the basic outline which we see in the New Testament. So this corroboration with non-Christian sources is huge. The last thing I want to take a look at, and this is pretty impressive, is just to think about how much our credibility is, or how much these sources' credibility is raised when they get these sort of details correct, okay? Because think about this for just a minute. We'll be done in just a few minutes here, but think about the New Testament authors claiming to be eyewitnesses, right? They claim to have seen these things with their own eyes. They claim to have touched Jesus, his resurrected body, so on and so forth. But is there any evidence that they were actually there? One of the things that historians, detectives, lawyers, judges, investigators think through is when the people who claim to be eyewitnesses, if they know details about the event that really only eyewitnesses could know about, that raises their credibility. If they know details about the weather, they know details about who was standing around at the time, those things are very difficult to know if you're not actually an eyewitness. So you can apply that same sort of thinking to the New Testament authors. Were they familiar with the things there in the vicinity going on in the first century? We can focus in on Luke when we make this argument. Luke was a really good writer in terms of the sense that he included a lot of historical information. Now, Luke wasn't an eyewitness, right? Luke is similar to Mark in the sense that he did research, he interviewed eyewitnesses, and then wrote down those accounts, both in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. But he was a very detailed writer. He ran with the Apostle Paul and got a lot of his information from Paul. But if you think through all the historical information just in the book of Acts, this is really helpful, this resource by Colin Hemmer. It lists, this historian, Dr. Hemmer, lays out 84 historically accurate facts in the book of Acts that we know are correct from other ancient sources. We're talking about things like the names of obscure local politicians and their appropriate governmental titles, precise geography, travel routes, local weather patterns, unusual cultural customs, practices, even slang words, all things that would be really difficult to know unless you were there. I mean, think about maybe your own hometown, somewhere here in Nebraska, here in the Midwest, somebody describing your hometown from 100 years ago. But they get names right, they get the geography correct, who were the major players, what was happening in the local politics. You would say, man, to get all those details right, they would either have had to be there, or get the information from folks who were there. Because remember, this is a time before Google, right? People just couldn't Google this information and find it. If you weren't there or weren't talking to people who were there, it would be very difficult to have these things down correctly. So we can look at just one example of this from the book of Acts. We know from two ancient Roman historians that the emperor Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. We just know that from ancient historical sources. But if you look at the book of Acts, Luke also mentions this. He mentions this situation where the Jews are being ordered to leave Rome. This is from Acts chapter 18. Now, Luke didn't really have a reason to include that. He's just recording, right, what happened, what was going on as he's describing Peter and Paul and what they're doing in the early church, Paul's missionary journeys. He's describing what's going on in the vicinity in that context that they're ministering in. And so he mentions this detail, just kind of nonchalantly talking about the people that they were running into, why they ran into them. Well, it's because the Jews were ordered to leave Rome. So it's this sort of corroboration that gives Luke, historians have found Luke to be a very trustworthy source because of all these details that he gets just right. You can look also at the Gospel of Luke, because even though we're focusing in on Acts, all of the credibility that Luke builds for himself in Acts carries over to the Gospel of Luke, because he wrote that as well. And you can see that, in the Gospel of Luke, where he is clearly trying to place his account in history. It doesn't seem like he's writing a story. This isn't a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? He's saying this is who was ruling at the time. He gives all these historical details. He doesn't use an exact year because they didn't have the year system that we do now. But we know from all of these rulers that he describes, he's specifically talking about AD 29. He's listing 8 well-known people from history. I mean, if you're making up a story, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to include all of these historical figures in your story if you're making them up, right? In fact, the New Testament includes 30 known individuals from history. So it just it doesn't seem as though this is a story that they're making up. All of these corroboration raises their credibility then, so when they do discuss the miracles, it gives us that much more certainty that they're telling the truth, because we have all of these non-Christian sources that corroborate the basic details of their account. All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for giving us all of this evidence. You have asked us to put our faith in you, to trust in Jesus as our Lord and Savior. But it's not a blind faith. You haven't asked us to, and you didn't ask your own disciples in the first century to believe in you, trust you blindly. But you've given us so many good reasons and evidence to trust you. And so our faith isn't a blind faith. It's not just wishful thinking. It's based on all these solid reasons and evidence that you've provided, that you've allowed to be carried down through history, so that we can evaluate it and be satisfied as we look at it from a historian's perspective, to try to understand, if these miracles really did take place. We're so thankful that you've given us this evidence so that our faith can be solid and founded on good reasons and evidence. It's in your name we pray. Amen.